This is the Erasing Shame podcast. Honest talk for healthy living, growing, and thriving.
Hello. Welcome to another episode of Erasing Shame, and I'm thrilled on this episode today to be joined with my season 1 co-host, Eunice Lee, and she has had almost a year to really think about shame on the back burner while she does her day job and is a parent to a young family and had lots of celebrations this month of May. And so glad you could come back and check in with our listening audience. Eunice, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you, DJ, for having me back. It's been quite a ride the last year. I'm just kind of settling into motherhood. And I'm also giving this idea of shame and healthy living kind of like a really good kind of marination in my head, I guess, because I realized that shame, Asian American shame, and it's specific to the culture, but shame is just so much around us, and it can be so toxic. That I've had some good conversations with other professionals, other friends about what shame means in their context. And so, it's been really good. And like you said, May has been a little crazy. Our entire family, my husband, my son, and I, we're all May babies. And so, I'm just tired. I'm happy. So.
Well, birthdays are supposed to be fun and celebratory, and happy birthday to everybody there.
Thank you. And I realized, like, with my husband's family, and I love them dearly, but they didn't make a big deal about birthdays. And my family was usually like a small celebration. And so one thing that my husband and I've always wanted to do is we want to do birthdays big. And we want to make sure that our son feels celebrated. And so with that comes, a lot of forethought into birthdays. So but celebrations, I realized when I was in my 20s, that's something that I wanted to add to our family culture. So here I am changing the culture. So
that's great. So let's hear how you did it.
Oh, the birthday or the family culture? Well, the birthday is going to be just small, good friends, family. His godfather is going to be around. And last year we did the Korean dol. So it's where you set out all of the things for their future. And we had my cousin brought a hanbok from Korea, and so he was all dressed up, and he kind of crawled towards the thing. He picked a book. But one thing I loved about that celebration is we didn't do a big one. We didn't do it at a country club or anything, but it was his village. It was the people who had been with us since my pregnancy, since even before that. And there's the men and women that are going to surround him and care for him in his life. And so I kind of want him to see that. And I felt like that was the message I want to give to him is no matter how mom and dad feel about you, you're already so loved by tangible people and they already know you. And so that's hopefully how our celebrations will go going forward. So we'll see. Yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful thing. That's great. And you're starting so young. And sometimes people don't experience that until like they're 18 when it's a rite of passage.
Yeah.
And to reinforce that can really shape a person because a lot of our personality gets shaped before 6 years old or something like that.
Really? Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And we thought about how in Asian American culture, there's no rite of passage to adulthood. It's usually marriage. We don't have bat mitzvahs. We don't have quinceañeras. We don't have something that says you're now an adult, because I think a lot of times our parents still see us as kids. And so we wanted to do something for our children to say, like when they're older, to say you're now an adult in charge of your life, versus you're always going to be our child, which is, now that I'm a mom, how I feel, how I think I'll always be tempted to feel. But yeah.
Well, you'll grow into it and out of it, hopefully, through the proper seasons of life.
Yeah.
So what have you learned about shame in relationships with different people and different people you've talked to, people who are Asians as well as non-Asians?
Yeah. Well, I've been, I think Brene Brown is a very popular topic right now. She just released her Netflix special. And I've been thinking about this a lot in terms of shame and receiving. And I think I started to think about this when a friend of mine, Sheila Sutton, she's a teacher, a professor, a therapist, but she was talking to me about this concept of, is that your story to tell? And how oftentimes we repeat stories without recognizing that there's privacy and there's intimacy. And when that's not honored, then we experience shame. And I know from my background, growing up in Korean church, there was no vault, there was no privacy and no intimacy. And so I think that because shame is relational in all contexts, not just Asian American context, relational freedom is also relational, like the freedom from shame. I think that particularly because Asian Americans are so relational, we tend to feel shame more deeply. So this idea of who are you to me, or who am I to you, is more emphasized in our culture. So I realized that the biggest thing when it comes to shame, erasing shame, isn't just sharing your story, but actually being received. So that little moment of kindness, the little moment of acknowledgement and validation that we experience when we are received, when we tell our story, but when we're received, I feel like that erases shame. So when you go to like conferences or churches, or when they share their testimony or their story, and they're kind of sharing about all their narrative of how everything has been in their life and how it's kind of all been redeemed, that in and of itself, I don't think would erase shame as much as it is afterwards when people come up and say, you did a great job, or I really related to that, or I feel like I can share my story now because you shared yours. Thank you for your courage. I think that erases shame. And that's such a beautiful thing.
That is a beautiful thing. So you've really picked up on this whole other dimension of shame, that shame is more than just feeling really badly about yourself.
Yeah.
It's not just a painful feeling about yourself because you've been in a certain situation, or you've been traumatized in some way, but it is also how people react to you, adding the word how people receive you, and by that, receiving you well.
Yes.
Perhaps using the word empathy. Is that appropriate?
Yes, exactly. And I like how you said react. I think that's a more concrete word than receive. I feel like receive is a little lofty. Yeah, how they react to you. So I've been doing this training called EMDR. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And what it is, it's basically, the science behind it is kind of like when we're in REM sleep, our eyes go back and forth. And that's how we process dreams. And so it's the same sensations of being in REM sleep. They have you move your eyes back and forth. And then you're actually reprocessing traumatic moments in a way that's digestible. And one thing, which sounds kind of, it sounds like it would be invalidating of our experience, but it's actually very validating, because trauma can be taken away with the presence of a non-judgmental other. So when you have a child that goes through a traumatic event, their parent figure that's there to receive them or to react, to say this is not your fault, is actually taking away the meaning of that trauma. And so I'm realizing that shame, so much, not just the level of it, but actually the receiving and the reaction of a loving, non-judgmental other, is going to provide relief from that shame and pave the way for healthy living.
Wow, that's such a healing thing. And so other people have a huge part to play in the erasing of shame and become the agents of healing. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a professional. It can just be a relative or a friend, and perhaps even a stranger.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that they've done studies about meditation versus therapy, and how meditation, we can only go so far because it's us saying it to ourselves, or like pure meditation, right? It's us kind of being with ourselves. But when it comes to therapy, it's trying to mimic this. Well, therapy is mimicking the idea of attachment to a parent figure, a relationship, and that's where the healing comes. And so, like you said, it doesn't have to be a mental health professional, but it can be a person in your life that you feel safe with, and that can acknowledge what you've been through and can then come to erase that shame with you.
Well, let's spend a little more time exploring this topic of being a safe person, or finding a safe person, as well as what would it take for someone to be non-judgmental? Because many of us grow up in an environment where we don't feel safe, and then we don't know when it is safe to begin disclosing ourselves and our pain and our shame. to begin that healing. And then we are also in a place where we get judged a lot for our mistakes or our imperfections, or grades not being 100.
Yeah. Well, I really do believe like that. That's a great question. How do we find those safe people? I don't know. I wish there was a formula for it. I feel like we can tell if a person's safe if they are able to, if they're able to hear our story without judgment, which is vulnerable on our part because we have to share our story in order to find those safe people. But the advice I would give to how to find a safe person is just to share just a little bit and see how it's received. Not to share everything and open up everything, but to share something small and take a look at their face and see if that they are judging, or they say something like, "Oh, I'm sorry you're like that, but I don't understand." Something that seems sympathetic but is actually very viscerally painful, right?
Perhaps one of the things that someone might react with is say, "Oh, you shouldn't feel that way."
Yeah.
And that's an automatic, okay, that person is not safe to talk to when they're not willing to hear and say your feelings are valid in the sense, not necessarily they agree, but feelings are just feelings.
Yeah.
And we should have that freedom and that safety to express them.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it has to do with our own gut feelings. So it's cultivating our sense of self and cultivating our sense of, oh, is this a safe person? I felt dismissed. That means that they might not be safe for me. So a lot of it is kind of our own self-awareness as well. Yeah.
Well, being Asian American, we don't exactly have a lot of family history in learning self-awareness. I know for me, it was well into my 30s before I began to discover my self-awareness, and I'm still discovering more into my 50s.
Yeah.
So what has helped you or helped others that you know develop that self-awareness?
I think that it takes courage to try to dive into like all the yucky parts of ourselves. And so I do notice that there's a trend with Asian Americans that we're often very relationally sheltered. We spend a lot of time with family. We know who we are in our family, and that's how we identify ourselves in our family, and that's how we go out into the world. But we don't actually receive a lot of feedback because we're not a confrontational culture. And so people won't say like, "Oh, that was weird what you said," or "I didn't like that," or "Hey, are you okay? Like, I just thought I got a vibe from you." Like, that's not often what happens in Asian American social culture. And so we kind of go through the world being a little insecure or a little unsure of where our self is. And I remember being, when I was younger, and I'm still learning now, that like, oh, this is how I come off to people. This is not feedback that I received from my home. So, I mentioned to you before we started recording that I started to do these attachment summaries with couples. I work with a lot of bicultural couples. And some of the questions on there are interesting because I started to kind of answer them for myself and for other Asian Americans, of questions like, who did you run to when you were hurt? Who comforted you? Who calmed you down? Who stuck up for you? Who did you feel safe? When you had a nightmare, where did you go? And I think that a lot of times we want to believe our parents are perfect. But on the assessment, it actually says if you over exaggerate how perfect your parents are, you actually have an avoidant attachment, which was interesting to me. And I don't think that a lot of us have those experiences where a parent stuck up for us or comforted us in the way that we needed, rather than the way that they needed, or validated our pain. I don't think that those things come naturally. And I think that it's an intergenerational issue where their parents didn't do it, and then their parents didn't do it. And so now that I'm parent age, and a lot of my peers are having kids, I'm realizing that, oh, this is stuff I have to work on myself because I didn't receive this. I didn't receive validation. I didn't receive comfort. I didn't receive, someone advocating for me. And so I have to learn all this. And yes, I know it on paper. I'm a therapist, but when it comes to those like really automatic instincts, I know that I have to actually work through it, rather than just learn about it. Another thing I think is self-awareness is experiencing pain. And oftentimes we avoid pain, right? And so when we avoid pain, we're not able to kind of we're not able to get to that place where we can learn from it and we can become aware and be aware of how strong we are. And so I think that that's kind of part of the culture as well, unfortunately. And that's something that I'm hoping that we can change in the next generation.
Yeah, wow, you've dug into some really heavy stuff, because even this concept of attachment theory, it comes in or what little I understand of it, and maybe you can explain, it comes out of a Western psychological context, whereas in the Asian cultural context, so much of our socialization comes from generations after generations, and there are things that are just passed along that are implicit, unexplained, and we just do what we know because that's all we know. And there's parts of us that are not developed. And I suppose in an Asian context where things are conformist and uniform, if you fit into those roles and responsibilities, then things are safe.
Exactly.
But when you're in a diverse environment like America, and then now with internet where you're exposed to so much diversity, then we're thrown into the ocean and have to swim.
Exactly.
So describe for us what attachment theory is, and I think you mentioned something about avoidant attachment.
Oh, yeah. So attachment theory was started, I think in the 50s or 60s. And basically what they did is they started to notice when toddlers would their parents would leave. And so they noticed that some of the toddlers would cry and be inconsolable. Some of the toddlers would cry and then be able to console themselves or be consoled by another adult. And then some of the toddlers were just like, okay, bye, mom. And they just went on playing. And so what they learned is that that's actually, there are different types of attachment. And those that were securely attached, they were able to cry and express their emotions and then self-regulate or co-regulate with an adult and then go on playing. The ones that actually just were very avoidant, very like crying a lot or not crying at all, they were actually avoidantly attached. Or anxious avoidant attached. I hope I'm not butchering this because I don't have the grid in front of me. But I think that often with my family, when a toddler doesn't cry, then we see that as good. We say, okay, good. She didn't cry because she's mature. And so that means she's securely attached. And that's not necessarily true from an attachment theory perspective. And this was done in like England, I think. So I understand that there's cultural differences, and I don't want to say that Asians are unhealthy and white people are healthy. Psychology comes from a Western perspective, but it is something to consider. Of like when we just do as we're expected. Does that really help us become self-aware, and does that help us become free people? And so this is actually something I've been thinking about for the last month or so, is this concept of a good daughter versus a bad daughter. And so I met with a woman in my mother's a preschoolers group, and she and I were talking about therapy, and she's in marketing. And we're just going over like, what are some good names for my therapy practice? And the one thing that kept coming to mind was like the Bad Daughter Project. And I was like, I don't think I would use that for my therapy practice. She was like, that's great. It's provocative. And I was like, I don't know. I don't think Asians would respond to it. It's kind of white. But then it made me start to kind of go down the rabbit hole of like, what is a good daughter and what's a bad daughter? And I remember growing up in my family, a good daughter was someone that went to the best schools, gone to the Ivy League, married a Korean doctor or a white doctor, and became like a stay-at-home mom, very domestic. And that was, and I, from, my teenage years, veered from that and was, quote unquote rebellious and wanted to be my own person, and was into the creative arts and things like that. And that, in their small definition, I was a bad daughter. And even now there will be little things where I will feel like I failed, even though my parents don't still put that on me because I'm an adult. I still feel like a bad daughter sometimes. I still feel like I wavered from this concept of a very narrow, very flat concept of good daughter versus bad daughter. And I think a lot of Asian American women particularly have that. I think all Asian Americans may feel that to a certain degree. I don't want to say all, but majority. But I think particularly with women, there's one narrative. And I realized that even though I didn't follow my parents' direction when it comes to being a good daughter. And my parents are good people, bless their hearts. They didn't mean to make me feel bad. But I realized that the definition of a good daughter and bad daughter kept wavering based on their perspective, based on their mood, based on whoever's kid at church did better, And so what I wanted to do is create this narrative, this collective of women who felt like they had failed as a daughter, been a bad daughter, but how they were now more full people because of it. Because I don't think I would be where I'm at. I don't think I'd be living in California. I don't think I would be in my profession. I don't think I would have the community I have if I were still and still be a good daughter from that narrow perspective. And so one thing that I hope to do at some point is to create like a small Google Doc or survey or something, a narrative of what it means to be a bad daughter from your home and what it means to be a full person, or how you failed and how that's actually given you grit and insight and courage to become the full person you are and find freedom. And I think that I hope other Asian American women can relate to me in being compared to, Jenny from church or, some another person in your grade, and experiencing that pain. And then also recognizing that when you step out of that, there's so much more richness outside of that. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's such a powerful thing. And I'm anticipating that many of our viewers and listeners will resonate with that. And please add a comment so that we can join this conversation, this growing community of others, and support each other and become more whole people. As you shared that, the image from that popular movie called Crazy Rich Asian, and the mom of the Nick, that was Rachel was dating Nick, and
Michelle Yeoh.
Michelle Yeoh's character was at the top of the stairs and said to the Rachel, "You will never be enough." And I could picture that even happening with mother-daughter dynamics. That I'm not sure. I'm not a daughter, so I don't know if the term they actually use is bad daughter, but the "you are not enough." I was like, wow, that really stung.
Yeah,
and I think viewers could relate to that.
I think so. And I think even in that image, if it were a biological mother and daughter, I think it would be said out of love. I don't think that it would be spiteful, because I think that our mothers, being immigrants and refugees and minorities in this country, they want to protect their daughters from what they believe to be a harsh world. And so to empower them might actually to push them towards kind of a foolish way of living. I think that might be the perspective of some moms, because as a mom, I want to protect my child from what I believe this world is. But I think that our mothers maybe weren't equipped with the ability to see the world as good. They just wanted to make sure their daughters survived. I don't think it was always a shame thing. I think that it was actually a survival tactic for some of the moms and daughters out there. And so, yeah, that image is just so stark, right? You'll never be enough. And how she stood up. Oh, she stood taller than her. And that was terrifying. Right. But yeah, that's the image. I can see that image of the bad daughter, the not good enough daughter, is always going to be there.
Wow, so much to think about, and it's so good to catch up with you again, Eunice.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And do you have a closing word as we wrap up this episode? I hope we can check in with you once in a while.
Yeah.
Your full life, but I'm glad it's becoming a whole life.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess I just want to encourage listeners. This podcast has been incredible, and the way that DJ you've led it, and it's taken shape, and all the different co-hosts and all the different guests that we've had on here. And I really want to encourage listeners, if they're kind of whether it's this episode or other episodes, that you're not alone out there, that no one holds your specific narrative because you're unique, but you're not alone in your pain. And I hope that you will find someone who can react with empathy and receive you, because that itself erases shame. And then when you are able to erase that toxic shame, there's a whole world out there for you that's waiting for you. And I hope that you get to experience that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Eunice. Thank you for that good word. And the world needs every person to go from surviving to thriving. So, okay, we'll wrap up this episode. Again, you can connect with us at erasingshame.com, and we'll add a link to Eunice's contact info so you can still reach out to her as well, because she has such a great, inviting personality.
Thanks.
All right. Have a great summer, and hope to see you in the fall.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you for being a part of Erasing Shame. Please rate and review on iTunes, subscribe on YouTube, and like on Facebook. Share with your friends and followers. Get all the details at erasingshame.com.